Hi everyone, welcome back to Grow Roots. This is Shannon and today I am going to be talking to you all about my most favorite plant ever, and that is Hydrangea Macrophylla, or Bigleaf Hydrangea, or some might call it Mophead Hydrangea. I have many types of hydrangeas in my garden here in North Texas, zone 8A/8B. We're on the border, and I have to say that the type of hydrangea that I have the most of is Hydrangea Macrophylla, or Bigleaf Hydrangea. In fact, the oldest plant that I have in my garden is actually almost, well, maybe even more than 13 years old. I've had it for 13 years, and it is what you see right behind me, my most treasured plant. I call it Big Daddy. It is an endless summer hydrangea that I received for Mother's Day in 2011. So in 2024, it is now 13 years old, and wow, I mean, just look, this is in late April and it is just really beginning to bloom. It is full of blooms and it is just absolutely spectacular, just a showpiece for my garden. But I have many other endless summer hydrangeas as well, and all of those are actually planted in the landscape in various locations, and I just absolutely love them. One of the things about living here in North Texas is that our summers get very, very hot. It seems like every summer we break more and more records, and so many people actually think that these guys, they struggle too much in the heat, and so you should not or cannot grow them here in North Texas. And that's the point of my video today. I'm here to give you lots of care tips and let you know how I've been successful in growing Hydrangea Macrophylla in my garden here in this hot southern North Texas climate. One of the most important factors that you need to keep in mind when you are trying to grow a Hydrangea Macrophylla or Bigleaf Hydrangea is the location. That is the most important thing. Hydrangea Macrophylla absolutely needs to be planted where it gets shade for a majority of the day. And if it does get sun, which it kind of does need a little bit of sun in order to bloom like this one, it needs to have 1 to 2 hours is ideal in my opinion, but it needs 1 to 2 hours of morning sun only. If you are in a very hot climate and this plant gets any type of afternoon sun at all, the blooms and the leaves will fry. Okay, and that's just the nature. And honestly, this is a Hydrangea Macrophylla as well. This is a separate plant, actually. It's in a different pot. This is a that brings me to talk about the two different types of Hydrangea Macrophylla. There is Mophead Hydrangeas, which are these guys, and then lace cap hydrangeas, which are these guys. The care for lace cap hydrangeas and Mophead hydrangeas is pretty much the same, and that's why they're all like lumped under the Hydrangea Macrophylla. But these guys should get 1 to 2 hours of morning sun only, and both of these are planted in containers, and this is a south facing porch. So in the morning the sun comes up over here and the sun comes in this way. So my lace cap actually gets a little bit, it gets sun first, and then this guy gets sun later, and it kind of gets the brunt of the sun that comes in. And last year, this is a younger hydrangea, and last year I did see that in the heat of the summer, the front facing leaves were starting to fry a little bit, even from just the morning sun. So yeah, too much sun is not a good thing for Hydrangea Macrophylla, and it will just cause the leaves to fry and the plant just to not thrive at all. But this guy gets about 1 to 2 hours of morning sun, and then in the shade the rest of the day. It does not get any other sun after that, and it is thriving. It has been in this location for 13 years, and it just seems to get bigger and better every single day. So talking about location again, you can plant them in containers. If you notice, this one is a very large container. These are large plants. They will get up to, and depending on what variety you have, I'm talking about, this one can get 5 feet tall by 5 feet wide. This guy in this container is probably, I don't know, 3.5 feet tall and maybe 4 feet wide. 3.5 feet by 3.5 feet maybe. And that's because it's in a container. So I'll bet if I planted this out in the landscape and it survives the transplant, then it probably would get 5 feet tall, which I will show you my other endless summer hydrangea that is much younger. It's about 5 years old, but it is close to 5 feet tall at this point, and it's planted in the ground. But one benefit to planting it in a container is that if it's not thriving in that location, you can move it and move it to more shade, most likely is what you're going to need to do. And another benefit, and we'll talk about this later, but you can control the soil acidity a lot easier when it's in a large container like this versus planted in the ground, and therefore you can get these beautiful blue blooms. I love them so much. I do like the pink, don't get me wrong, but blue blooms, they just are stunning. And I achieve this by adding soil acidifier to the soil. And I do this to all of mine for various reasons, but this one turns blue because it is in the container, and it can ramp up the soil acidity a lot easier than if it was in the ground. So you can plant them in the ground as well. They will do just fine. You will probably need to amend the soil a little bit. They are tolerant of clay and sandy soils. However, they do like a lot of organic matter. They like, I mix my soil with compost, and then I add a lot of mulch on top of my hydrangeas, even the ones in the containers, especially these guys in late fall. They need a really thick layer of mulch to insulate them during the winter. So if you are planting in a large container, you do need to keep in mind that whatever variety of bigleaf hydrangea you have, generally they will survive zones 3 through 8 or 9. But if you have it in a large container, then the roots are not insulated by the ground, and so you need to consider, oh, that was just a hummingbird, y'all, yay. You need to consider that the temperatures that the hydrangea is going to feel at the roots is going to be one zone lower than the current temperature. So if you're in zone 4 and you have planted this in a container, you need to have a hydrangea that can survive zone 3 temperatures. And in order for it to survive that as well, you really need to put a nice thick layer of mulch in the late fall, which I do anyway. Even though I'm in zone 8, we experience zone 7 temperatures frequently in the wintertime, and I don't want my my buds that have already been formed, which create blooms for the next year, I don't want those to get damaged. So I insulate it with mulch, and then if we get a really big temperature dip or really low temperatures, I will cover this with frost cloth just to be safe. The plant will survive, but it's possible that the buds for next year's blooms will be damaged. And so I will, if we get large temperature swings, or if we get really low temperatures, I cover it in frost cloth so that my blooms for next year are not damaged. So that's something to keep in mind for sure, especially when you're planting it in large containers. But planting it in the ground, amend your soil, make sure that it's in a location that gets only a little bit of morning sun, and then shade the rest of the day. Dappled shade is probably okay. I have 6 endless summer hydrangeas planted in my side garden, which is dappled shade all day long. It doesn't get any sun whatsoever, but it's dappled shade all day long, and they are actually doing really, really well there. The leaves did not fry at all last summer in the heat of the summer. So yeah, just keep in mind your location, and it's really, really important when you're thinking about Hydrangea Macrophylla, especially if you're in a hot climate like I am. Okay, another very important factor to keeping Hydrangea Macrophylla happy, especially if you're in a hot climate, is water. And a lot of people know this, but they don't know the specifics on keeping their plant happy with water. So hydrangea, hydra, and then angea, actually literally translated in ancient Greek, is water vessel. However, it did not get its name because of its need for a lot of water, although it does. It actually got its name because the petals themselves kind of look like cups. And so it was given the name water vessel or hydrangea. But it's good that it has that name because it reminds people hydra means water. You need to water this plant really well. It likes a lot of water. So let's start from the very beginning. Say you're picking up a Hydrangea Macrophylla because they're in the stores right now and they're looking beautiful and you just have to have it. So you get it and you want to plant it. So again, think about location. That's first. And then number two, when you are planting it, you need to keep in mind the time of day that you're planting it. So please do not plant like you're planting it into a pot or you're planting it into the ground. Do it in the early morning hours or in the late evening hours, not in midday hours where it's the heat of the day. Even right now in the spring here in Texas, we get to 85 degrees some days. Please do not plant your hydrangea in the heat of the day. It will not appreciate it. And that's not giving it the best start, right? You want this plant to thrive. You want it to get a great start. So don't do it when it's super hot, when it's going to lose a lot of water. So the reason that this plant needs a lot of water, let me try and find one. The leaves, it's called Bigleaf Hydrangea for a reason. These leaves are massive, y'all. And so you can imagine with all of these beautiful, huge, big leaves, the surface area of the leaves, it evaporates water very, very quickly, especially when it is hot and especially when it is windy. And the roots are somewhat shallow on this plant, although I don't think they're as shallow as some people say. But when you see a hydrangea get droopy, which I call them drama queens because they will tell you when they want water because they get super droopy. When they do get droopy, that doesn't always mean that it needs to be watered immediately. What it means is the plant is evaporating water from the surface of the leaves faster than the roots can take up the water to replenish that water supply. So you might still have water down there. The problem is it's so hot or so windy and hot that the water is evaporating quickly than the roots can supply it with water. So my rule of, like, people tell you water it immediately when it gets droopy. I'm gonna say something different. When it gets droopy, wait until like the evening when everything has kind of cooled off a little bit. And if it is still droopy, like maybe an hour after, you know, the sun has gone down or an hour after it's gotten cooler, if it's still droopy, it checks the soil. If it is dry, then yes, definitely water it. If it's, oftentimes you're going to see it's kind of recuperated, like, oh, thank you, it's not as hot, I'm okay now because I'm able to get the water up and I'm able to do what I need to do. So, but I will say this, going back to like originally planting your plant, you want to water every single day. And if it's hot, then you might need to water that newly planted hydrangea a couple times a day. One thing that's really important as well is when you water early in the morning. That gives the plant time to get that water up into the leaves like it needs to before it gets super, super hot. So watering early morning, no matter how old the plant is really important. And then newly planted hydrangeas are going to need a lot of water until they get established. And then even existing hydrangeas are probably going to need to be watered once a day in the morning, especially in the summertime. And then you are going to need to check on them. Like I said, if they get droopy, look at them in the evening, or maybe you can even let them go to the next morning to see, are they still droopy early in the morning before it gets hot. And definitely do not let a hydrangea go too long being droopy without getting water, because that will start to damage the plant. But I would say it's not an immediate emergency. If you see a droopy hydrangea, they are drama queens. It's just them telling you that they are evaporating water faster than they can take it up, because their leaves are so massive and beautiful. And so they need a little bit extra care when it comes to water, for sure. All right, so the next thing that I wanted to talk about with Hydrangea Macrophylla is fertilizing. That's a question that I get a lot, is how often do I fertilize, when do I fertilize, all that kind of stuff. So first off, if you're planting a hydrangea plant for the very first time, or you know, you're putting it in a pot or you're putting it in the ground, you definitely want to use something like Espoma Biotone. This is a root fertilizer that helps it to not get transplant shock. It helps the roots establish, and it's great for healthy root growth. So I always use Biotone every time I'm planting a plant, but especially Hydrangea Macrophylla, because it helps the plant a lot to get established. And then I fertilize typically twice a year. And when I fertilize, I usually have in the past used Espoma Plant Tone. So I do this in very late winter or early fall when you see that the leaves are starting to emerge, just kind of the plant is waking up from its winter slumber, then it needs some food. And so I have found Espoma Plant Tone. It is a slow release fertilizer, and it just does an absolute great job in getting the hydrangea what it needs in just when it's starting to put on its growth. And then if I can remember, I also apply again in July. There are some years that I just have not remembered to do that, and it has done just fine. But another fertilization in July, and then that is it, because it's going to start going dormant. It's going to start, you know, doing what it needs to do and preparing for the winter time. But this year I used a different one, because I found out that this one is actually specific for, I know it says rose tone, it's Espoma rose tone, but roses are flowering shrubs, and so are hydrangeas, and so their fertilization needs are very, very similar. And I learned from Jenny with Gardening with Creekside that rose tone is actually a really good fertilizer to use specifically for Hydrangea Macrophylla. So I used this year. This is the first year I've used it. And look, I mean, this is, I think because of the winter and the spring that we had, it's you know, optimal for the blooms on the hydrangeas this year anyway. But the rose tone, maybe that helped too, because I have probably 50 blooms, I'm not kidding, on this guy. It's just going to be covered in blooms before I know it, and probably one of my best years ever for blooms. So yeah, anyway, rose tone is great. And if you don't, really just any slow release fertilizer is really, really good. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is chlorosis. So there are specific fertilization needs for some hydrangeas because they can be prone to something called chlorosis. And the plants that are in my my side garden actually do have this, and then the one planted in, typically it's the hydrangeas that are planted in the ground that have a hardest time with this. And in my climate in North Texas with our clay soil, it's hard. So let me explain what chlorosis is. Chlorosis is a yellowing of the leaves, and then you'll see dark green veining of the leaves as well. And what that is telling you is that the plant is having a really hard time in iron uptake. So it's not getting enough iron to the plant. And there's two reasons potentially for this. The first reason is that the soil has to be acidic in order for hydrangeas to take up iron into their plant systems. So if the soil is not acidic enough, which our soil typically is not, then it's not going to be able to take up the iron that's already in the soil, and the leaves turn yellow and have dark green veining as a result, and the plant is just not thriving, right? Because it doesn't have the iron. So the first thing that I do when I see that is I add soil acidifier. I use, again, Espoma. It just happens to be like they have the great products for the hydrangeas, and this is what I use. Soil acidifier for chlorotic hydrangeas will acidify the soil so that they can intake the iron that's in the soil. So that's step one. If my plant has chlorosis, I'm going to acidify the soil as best I can and try that. I also add, this is the first year that I've started doing that, I'm also adding coffee grounds as well, and that seems to actually be helping. So soil acidifier, and I'm going to talk about how I use this to turn the blooms blue in just a bit, so hang tight. Right now I'm talking about chlorosis. So I'll add soil acidifier and see if that works. If that doesn't work, then that means there's not enough iron in the soil for the plant to use. So then I go in with, I don't have it with me, but it's called chelated iron, and it's a concentrated bottle, and it says chelated iron on it, and you mix it with the appropriate concentration with water, and you water your plants with the chelated iron. You can water the leaves as a foliar thing as well, and you can water the soil, and I like to do both, so I do kind of a double application on the leaves and the soil. And so that just adds the iron into the soil that the plant needs, and hopefully that helps with the chlorosis. And you may have to do that several times, and I typically do. So the reason I think I have such a problem with the hydrangeas in my side yard is that is a new garden bed. So it is a majority clay. It hasn't been, I have amended it with compost, and then I've added more compost, and I've added mulch, but it's only 2 years old, so it's only had 2 years worth of compost and mulch and all of that in the original amendments. It hasn't, like my front garden, that hydrangea doesn't have as much of a problem with the chlorosis, or it's easily fixed because that garden bed is rich in organic matter. I have been adding compost and wood chips and things like that to that garden for, you know, a good 10 years now. So it's good soil. The one on the side yard is not the best soil. So it does have a little bit of a problem with chlorosis. But again, soil acidifier and chelated iron, and that should fix that problem as well. Okay, so now for the fun part about Hydrangea Macrophylla, and that is talking about the bloom color. So first I want to say that I don't think every Hydrangea Macrophylla now it has a bloom color that changes. The original Hydrangea Macrophyllas, the blooms are either going to be blue if the soil is on the less acidic or basic side, or the blooms will be pink if the soil is acidic. And so this is an endless summer hydrangea, and I think my lace cap hydrangea, if I can ever get it to bloom, will be the same. That it'll either be blue if the soil is basic or pink if the soil is acidic. However, nowadays they have all of these new varieties of Hydrangea Macrophylla out now that I don't know if those, because you see, like for example, the newest one on the market is Eclipse, and its blooms are like red. I have no idea if those blooms will change color if it's acidic versus basic. I don't have experience with a lot of those new varieties. I have the basic, like, endless summer varieties and the regular lace cap varieties, and so mine are either blue or pink, but yours might be different based on the variety that it is. Okay, so with that said, you can try and manipulate the color blooms that you have. I will say this, if your hydrangea is in a container, it is going to be a lot easier to change the color to blue. If your hydrangea is in the ground, you probably will have pink blooms most of the time, but I will say that I do believe that it's possible to get at least partially blue blooms, and I got one last year. So wow! So yeah, the way that you do that, if you want blue blooms, then you're going to use soil acidifier, and basically it's a good amount that you're going to apply all the way around the drip line of the plant, the base of the plant, and you want to do that. I typically do it right as I see those brand new buds forming, like not quite even this far along. I'll do it before it gets to this. You can see they're itty bitty little babies, and so I'll put the soil acidifier on then. And I'm getting ready to do a new round of soil acidifier because these are the blooms that came out first. They are definitely blue, but some of the newer ones are a little bit more purple, which tells me the soil is already becoming more basic because it's been watered probably. Our water is very basic, and so yeah, you're kind of fighting that all the time. If you want to keep blue blooms, you'll probably have to reapply the soil acidifier for the next round of blooms that come so that they can be blue as well. And then sometimes they'll be in between, like this is purple and this is telling me that the soil's kind of an in between right now. But one thing that I got last year with my endless summer hydrangea in the ground in my front garden, I was able to get a partially blue bloom and partially pink bloom, and it was the most spectacular thing I've ever seen. amazing. I was so happy to get that. I thought it was so beautiful and unique and rare, and I don't know how I achieved it. I don't know if I'll be able to achieve that again, but it was really fun. And that was one that was in the ground. So it is possible. You just probably need a lot of soil acidifier if you're here in my climate. If you're in another climate that has acidic soil, then I believe it's Spoma also makes another one, and that is, I want to say it's limestone or lime something, but it is what would make your soil, you know, go from acidic to basic to turn the blooms pink if that's what you wanted. So you definitely can manipulate the bloom color. The other thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of blooms and bloom color is, this is something that I did not know until maybe 2 or 3 years ago, but these are the first blooms. These are the first blooms of the season. And when these blooms are kind of done, they're going to fade into a green color. And I'm going to encourage you to leave them on the plant. Some people will just prune the bloom head right off when it turns green, and I used to do that. I don't really like it when it turns green. It's not my favorite. However, if you leave it until about September, October, when the nights start getting colder, it'll turn from green to pink around the edges of the petals. And then if you continue to leave it, that pink color envelops the bloom even more. And then by November and December, it's going to turn a beautiful magenta color. Perfect for the fall. The leaves also turn colors as well. The leaves will turn a magenta color before they fall. And so for the leaves to turn this like purplish magenta color, and then these blooms will get like a really deep, dark purple magenta. It is beautiful, and it's so fitting for November and December and Christmas and all of the things that go with that. So I encourage you guys to leave your blooms on if you can stand it. And they will eventually turn a pink color for you when your nights start getting cooler, and before, you know, the winter time, and before it goes dormant, they'll be like this really beautiful deep purple color. So it's spectacular, and that's not something that everybody knows, so you learned something for sure. Okay, so the next topic that I wanted to talk about is pruning. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about pruning because I actually made an entire video on how to prune your hydrangeas, when and how much, and the different types of hydrangeas and all of that. So I'm not going to talk too much about it. I will link that video up in the upper right corner so that you can click on it and watch that. I will just say that in regards to pruning, I don't really prune my Hydrangea Macrophylla at all, except in the very late winter time, and I go in and I figure out which of the branches are completely dead and which are still alive, and I prune off the completely dead branches. But I've only started doing this in the last couple years. Before this, I did not prune at all, and the reason that you need to be very careful unless you know what you're doing is because if you prune this plant, you are potentially pruning off next year's blooms. Hydrangea Macrophylla will set its blooms for next year actually in mid to late summer, and so that's one of the reasons, you know, that people don't see their hydrangeas blooming like they should. If they've done any kind of pruning from midsummer on, then they have potentially cut off next year's blooms. So really, as a general rule of thumb, if you don't watch my pruning video, just know, in general, just don't prune it unless you know what you're doing. And please watch that video so that you learn more about it, and if you really want to shape it and do those kinds of things, you'll know when and how to do that. And that discussion of pruning leads perfectly into what I was going to talk about last, and that is the most frequently asked question in terms of caring for Hydrangea Macrophylla is, why is my Hydrangea Macrophylla not blooming? So there are several reasons for this, and I just talked about one of them. The most common and the common reason for them not to bloom is pruning. They bloom on old wood usually, and so if you have cut and pruned off those buds that have formed for next year's blooms, then you're not going to have next year's blooms. Depending on the type of Hydrangea Macrophylla that you have, it will either only bloom on old wood, or it will bloom on old wood and new wood, like the reblooming one that I have, which is an endless summer hydrangea. Endless summer hydrangeas will bloom on both old wood and new wood. So even if you cut off last year's blooms, you won't see this in the springtime, because these are the buds that formed last summer, okay? But later on in the season, in July, you'll see another bloom, and that's all of the new growth that is putting on new blooms as well. And that's what's really great about the reblooming varieties of Hydrangea Macrophylla. And so you'll have double the opportunity, double the chance too, if you have a reblooming variety. So I highly recommend that. However, you see this beautiful one. This is my lace cap hydrangea. It is a variegated lace cap hydrangea, and I love it so much. But this is just its second season, and I still have yet to see it bloom. Lace cap hydrangeas bloom on old wood only. And so I think what happened my first year is I think I did prune some things last year, if I'm not mistaken. And so I didn't see blooms last year because I did kind of prune it a little bit. This past year, I've had it one full year now, and I have not pruned it at all. And I've done everything that I know to do, and I still am not seeing blooms on it. So one other reason that you may not see blooms on your Hydrangea Macrophylla is heat stress. So if your Hydrangea Macrophylla is getting too much sun, it's going to stress the plant out, and therefore it may not bloom. Now, this one is right next to this one, and this one is blooming and that one is not, and so I don't think that's what it is. Although I did tell you earlier in this video that the sun comes in this way, and so it gets the sun first. So maybe that 15 minutes more of sun, or the brunt of the sun, because the sun comes in this way, so this side of the plant gets the brunt of the morning sun. Maybe, I don't know. Another reason is the flip side of that. And if your hydrangea doesn't get any sun at all, then perhaps that is the reason that it is not blooming. I have in the summer hydrangeas in my shade garden that get dappled sun only. Like, they're covered by a crepe myrtle tree, and so whatever is in between those leaves is what that hydrangea gets, or those hydrangeas get, and they're still, I will say half of them are putting on buds right now and half of them are not. They're not blooming yet, but I mean, they're still blooming, and I do think they probably would be blooming better if they got more sun. I do think that's the case, but I am still getting blooms on more than half of those. So anyway, that may or may not be a reason for you. And then another reason that your hydrangea may not be blooming is it getting enough water? Is it getting too much water? Is it getting not enough water? Water stress, as you know, in addition to heat stress that we just talked about, water stress also could cause the plant, not to put on blooms. And so water stress is definitely not an issue with this guy. It gets the same, like, it's on your irrigation, it's on a drip system. So water's not the issue with this guy. It gets morning sun, so not enough sun is not an issue. The only thing I can think of with this guy, it brings me to my last one, is how old is your hydrangea and how long has it been planted there? So immature hydrangeas, they won't bloom for at least 2 to 3 years. Okay, so that's a definite, like, you're not going to see a baby hydrangea bloom. Okay, and if you do in the nurseries, I'm sure that they've done something like a forced bloom type of situation. Okay, so yeah, immature hydrangeas, and then after being planted, they kind of like to settle themselves, and so they may not bloom the first couple years for you after you have planted. I mean, they're gonna have that initial bloom because you've just bought them from the nursery and they look all beautiful because they've been raised in a greenhouse. But in true conditions, here in our homes, they're gonna try to get settled before they're gonna start showing you blooms. And so I kind of think that's what's going on with this guy. I'm gonna be patient. I'm hoping maybe next year I'll see blooms, because this guy doesn't have any buds or blooms on it. So I'm not gonna see blooms this year again. Maybe next year. And then if it still continues to not have blooms, it's gonna be, I have no idea type of thing, and just something that happens. But generally, those are the things that you want to look for when you're considering why my hydrangea is not blooming. All right, so the very last thing that I wanted to talk about with Hydrangea Macrophylla is pests and other problems that the plant may have. So honestly, I have found Hydrangea Macrophyllas to be pretty resistant to most pests. I have found aphids on them and I have found spider mites on them. However, it doesn't really affect the plant that much. I have found that the aphids can cause like the leaves to be a little bit bumpy, but it's totally fine. And then I have found spider mites on these guys somewhat heavily towards the top up here, and it has not affected anything whatsoever. But I do not like spider mites, and I do not want them to spread to my other plants, and so I will spray with Captain Jack's Dead Bug or insecticidal soap, and then I will reapply about 7 to 10 days later to try and get rid of the spider mites or the aphids, and I found that fairly effective. But again, these plants don't seem to be bothered by a whole lot of pests at all. One other problem that you can get, and that's because they like water so much, is you can get like a leaf spot, a bacterial leaf spot. So if you see that your hydrangea is starting to get spots on the leaves, like red spots, then that's probably some type of bacteria or fungi, and you can treat that with a copper fungicide. Again, I like to use Captain Jack's copper fungicide, and I'll spray it with that. But honestly, my Hydrangea Macrophyllas have not had that problem at all. I've never had that problem with this guy in 13 years. Now I have an oak leaf hydrangea that does have that problem right now that I just sprayed with copper fungicide. But hydrangeas can be prone to that, and just know that, and it's okay. Usually they're just fine, but just keep that in mind. But usually they aren't prone to a whole lot of pests or problems in that area. So whew, that's I feel like I've just been chatting all of your ears off because I just love this plant so much. But I really wanted to tell you everything that I knew about trying to successfully grow a Hydrangea Macrophylla in our hot climate of North Texas. So I'm here to tell you that it can be done, and you can do it quite successfully, because look at that. They can thrive under the right conditions when you know how to care for them. So I think they're worth every bit of effort, in my opinion. And really, honestly, I don't think it's that much effort. I just make sure that they have enough water. I make sure that I'm pruning it correctly. I'm making sure that I'm planting them in the right location. And that's really all I'm doing. Water is probably the biggest maintenance in terms of hydrangeas, and knowing when to water them and when not to, and how to get them the water that they need and the conditions that they need. So that's really it, and I think it's worth every bit of effort, because I think they are just the most beautiful plants ever. I love them so much. I hope that you have been inspired, and I hope that you have maybe changed your mind about growing them if you're in a hot climate. I thank you all so much for watching. Please hit that subscribe button so you can get more videos on the plants in my garden and garden tours every month as well. Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful day, everybody. Bye-bye.